afternoon, CSMFO. This is Rich Lee, your podcast co-host and producer. I am live here in Sacramento with some colleagues from Cal Cities here to give you an update on the latest legislative session. We're going to hand it off to Ben Triffo from Cal Cities to give a bit of a overview, and then we'll kind of dig into the details. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Ben.
Great, thanks, Rich. Ben Triffo with League of California Cities. Quick background for everyone. Cal Cities is an education and advocacy organization. We focus on expanding and protecting local control. We do that in the courts, at the legislature, and the ballot box. I am our Revenue and Taxation legislative advocate, so I handle everything from sales tax, property tax, Prop 218, Prop 26, everyone's favorite dinner time conversation. With that, I'll hand it on over to Melissa.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. And my name is Melissa Sparks-Kranz. I'm also a legislative advocate here at Cal Cities, and I cover our environmental quality portfolio. So that means anything that could impact our cities, from water supply, energy, climate planning and funding, CEQA, all of the fun topics that I know a lot of our cities work on. And I'll pass it over to Brady.
Good afternoon. My name is Brady Guertin, and I'm the legislative advocate for housing, community, and economic development here at Cal Cities. So my portfolio focuses on land use, development impact fees, zoning, and everyone's favorite topic, housing and economic development. So excited to be here today.
So welcome, and thank you so much for having me here at Cal Cities in Sacramento. We're going to start with Brady. We're going to talk about housing production and fiscal impact, specifically SB 79, and we'll talk a little bit about land use and some infrastructure. So SB 79, a lot of my council members have been talking about it, and I will say that land use and housing, not my area of expertise nor my wheelhouse, so I had to do a little bit of research before I came here to better understand it. For CSMFO members and fiscal officers, can you go and provide an explanation of why this was a big legislative win for housing advocates? And can you kind of summarize what it does and why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. And SB 79 was a huge issue of interest to Cal Cities this year. We were heavily engaged. We had nearly 200 cities that were engaged on this legislation. And, you know, it was a big win because historically, Senator Wiener, who has been a very big proponent of a lot of housing legislation since he's been into office, has been trying this effort for around 10 years. It was a big challenge historically. It was stopped before it got to the floor and some other stuff, and it was very similar with SB 50 and some of these rules. So SB 79 went through the process this year. It had 13 different amendments, so a lot of engagement from a lot of advocates, Cal Cities being one of them. You had the unions and the building trades, as well as the affordable housing groups, and then also the advocates for market rate housing and stuff like that. So it was a really big challenge. It got a lot of attention, and what it does is it requires local jurisdictions in 8 urban transit counties to approve residential housing projects. And this will be done with limited environmental review or public engagement, because it's going to be an allowed use, which basically says a local government can't say no. And it's near specific transit stops. So your light rail, your heavy rail, you think of BART, you think of Metrolink, you think of designated bus lanes also qualify for this. And they're kind of broken up into tiers. So it's a really detailed, complex bill, but the longer implication is near transit stops in California in the 8 counties, which those 8 counties, for those keeping track, are going to be Los Angeles, San Francisco, Alameda, Sacramento, Orange, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and San Diego. They're the ones that are going to be impacted by this, and all other counties are going to be exempted from the bill. And much different from where it started in the process. It was going to be everywhere, and it got limited over the process. It had a really tough sled to get through, and Cal Cities was heavily engaged on those conversations. There was also debate around affordability levels and what that looks like. And so this bill basically says local governments will be required to approve transit-oriented development projects, high-rise residential, from 6 to 9 stories tall. and you will have to do this regardless of your state certified state certified housing element that each city has approved. So a lot of challenges for that, when you think of infrastructure and the funding that you need to support that kind of development. But there's a lot of other kind of niche areas with this that I won't get into today, but definitely encourage you to reach out to your city attorneys if you're impacted, because there's a lot to the bill.
So I was thinking about this last night as I was preparing for this and going on a walk. And 7 years ago, now thank you for the context of, this only applies to certain counties. 7 years ago, I was going to a CSMFO chapter meeting that was hosted in Lathrop. And I remember driving around and seeing all these signs that said 10,000 acres of land available for redevelopment. Before the chapter meeting, I met up with the finance director and the deputy finance director, and I was looking at the map of Lathrop on their wall. And I asked, what is the median sales price of a single family home here? And at that time, it was maybe $400,000. And I said, well, what is your share of the property tax dollar? And I can't recall what it was, but it was, probably a little bit below average. And then they said, but we have CFDs. And when you take the 1% levy plus the CFD, it was pretty dang close to 2% of assessed value. And I was thinking about that, and I said, well, because of the impact that these developments would have on infrastructure demand, what's likely to happen is that many of these counties and cities will probably have to have some kind of land secured financing to pay for the infrastructure, which ultimately is probably going to be put back onto the property owner. First the developer will pay for it, but then ultimately it'll be the property owner. So if the intent is to kind of accelerate housing and the development of housing, there's some pressure there. And I'm sure that, the state and Cal Cities had already anticipated that, but it was just something that I was thinking about last night.
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue. And, when you look at how you're going to support that infrastructure, to your point, developers originally are going to probably be in charge of supporting that, especially in new developments. Local governments have some tools regarding impact fees, which we can't charge more than the cost of the service.
Right.
So we're very limited in that. But I will say the conversations in recent years have been looking at those issues. And so it's going to be a challenge as we increase residential capacity, trying to find that balance of how do we support that without having it go back to people that are, renting and owning homes, because, there's got to be a way to do that. But it's going to be a challenge for a lot of local governments to figure out their financing and how to support that increased growth for these infrastructure areas.
I was having a conversation with a colleague, and unfortunately they were one of the few that either their housing element had not yet been certified or it got decertified. So they actually had developers basically invoke the builder's remedy. And that kind of brings up the SB 79 and just this further loss of local control. I'm curious about what your thoughts are in Cal Cities and what you've been hearing from Cal Cities members on just this erosion of local control.
Yeah, as housing legislation's really moved that way, there's been around 500 bills that have looked at housing since 2015, give or take. It really became a really hot topic with the growth of a lot of kind of the advocates that you see with the YIMBY movement, and also you see a lot of people getting elected that are very big proponents of, eroding local control, because in their eyes they see local governments as like a barrier for the permitting process. Cal Cities is on the forefront of ensuring that, not that we're anti-housing, we're here to support housing, but we think that locals have a better approach in terms of zoning and planning for it, because they know their community best and they work with their community best, and they need to account for it because each city is different. So we have housing bills all the time that look at these issues, and Cal Cities is on the forefront of ensuring that we have that. And it's really important because you want your community to be bought in. When you go through the housing element process, there's a bunch of processes you have to do, public engagement and stuff like that. So it's a challenge where you go through all this work and then it comes in and you get a streamlining bill that says all that work that you did is now doesn't matter. You have to do the statewide one size fits all zoning standards that can be very challenging for communities, that it doesn't work for everyone. And so Cal Cities is leading the charge on ensuring that we have local flexibility and making sure that local governments and their communities are heard as they, look at housing and stuff like that.
The other thing I was thinking about, and San Francisco is one thing because it's a city and a county, but LA, I think you mentioned LA County was one of them. I'm more of a Northern California guy, but in LA County there's the huge, gigantic, one of the largest cities in the United States, LA. But then there are other smaller cities within that, because of the way that property tax works. And the presumption is that the majority of the transit-based infrastructure is largely around the larger metro areas. So if you're having more development happen in the larger metros and less so in the smaller municipalities, because of the way that property tax is allocated, then their share of the pie will go up more over time compared to the smaller agencies. So I don't know if that was something that the state or Cal Cities had done some analysis on.
So I don't handle property tax as much as Ben, so he's a good one to ask about that one. So I can either defer to him or...
I was lucky enough not to be involved in SB 79. Brady drew the short stick on that one. But no, the fiscal impacts on these measures is always something that we are, mindful of. And, I think for this one, knowing that we looked at it primarily through the lens of, the housing and the land use, angle. But we were mindful of the potential impacts, of the fiscal impact of the bill. That said, Brady did mention there was nearly 13 different sets of amendments to the bill. This thing was, changing over time, or nearly overnight, it seemed. And so kind of getting a grasp on it as it made its way through the, waning hours of session was a little bit difficult. But now I think now that we've been afforded the opportunity to take a step back, I think there needs to be a little bit of a postmortem on this thing to take a look at, if this is the direction the state is moving, what are going to be the impacts if there's going to be more policies like this going forward.
So let's say I'm the finance officer for my agency for one of the counties that you mentioned, and the assumption can be because of SB 79 that development is going to the acceleration of development. So there's the general fund forecast, which you might change some assumptions, but then there's the probably coordination with your public works department on what are the demands and the requirements of sewer, water, utilities, et cetera. What are some of the things that our finance officers should be thinking about as they kind of revise their assumptions?
Yeah, definitely. One of the challenges, so local governments are very limited in their ability to support those. As we all know, general funds can be very limited too. Obviously, it varies by city, but the challenge that you have right now too, so you kind of have these overlapping priorities. You want housing, which we support. We need housing for sure. We have a housing crisis. The downside is how do we support the infrastructure to do that? And right now the tools with the loss of redevelopment, with Prop 13, with a variety of factors, that there's very limited in their ability to get the funds that they need to support that growth. So one of the best one of the opportunities they have is through impact fees, mitigation fees. You go through nexus studies for multiple years and validate the cost of it. And as I mentioned, you have to do that to only provide the cost of service. We're not making money off of it. And so you have this dynamic of you need housing, but you also need it to be affordable. How do you balance that? And the challenge that local governments and the finance officers are going to have to think about is as you're increasing demand for services for public, fire, parks, schools, and a variety of other quality of life things that residents need, parks, libraries, et cetera. How do you balance that? How do you forecast that? How do you get your general fund to balance that? And you're obviously handicapped. And if with the continuous push that we've seen in recent years to limit one of the tools that local governments have with impact fees, which are really important to support that, it's going to be a really big challenge of forecasting and looking at the future to figure out how you can balance that.
So one of the things that, best practice is, I believe it's every 5 to 7 years, you want to take a comprehensive look at your impact fees. As a part of that analysis, and our agencies are likely looking at working with consultants that help them, but as a part of the analysis, they look at what neighboring agencies are doing. And the thought behind that is, if I'm a developer and I'm looking for a place to do infill development or TODs, that if, let's say, the city right next door, if their impact fees are less onerous than what they are in your city, guess where they're going to go, right? So I think there's all the finance officers and all the elected officials and all the city managers are all looking around because they don't want to be the one that stands out in a bad way. But I think there's probably some risks associated with that, right? Where over time, and you're absolutely right, level setting the fees to make sure that they're not any more than what we need. And, I'd say homeowners and developers are mindful of that. We saw that, what was the, I'm forgetting the name of the case, but it was the El Dorado Hills case, right? So that's certainly at the forefront for us. What other kind of risks do you think are there with these impact and mitigation fees that they're not going to keep pace with the demand?
Yeah, so, in theory, impact fees are supposed to be matched with demand and keep pace with development. As I mentioned, cities have a process that they go through. So as cost of materials and land goes up, you would think it would be able to kind of balance that. But one of the challenges you see is that we have to be able to match that. And if you aren't able to move as quickly, it's going to be a challenge. But, also if it's something that local governments are, the other thing that local governments are dealing with in this instance, right? So we want it to keep pace with demand so we can match it. And in theory, an impact fee should do that. But we're also getting pressure to keep costs low. And to your point, if you have some cities defer impact fees voluntarily until different areas of the permitting process. Some collect them up front, some wait till certificate of occupancy, some might have some other subsidies to do that. But the challenge that you'll see is, it doesn't work for every city. It doesn't work for every city, and the push to try to delay that could lead to infrastructure not being able to stay up, and now you have general fund revenues that have to kind of backfill that, and that leads to a variety of other challenges locally. And until the state would have to look at, if impact fees were the next kind of low-hanging fruit that the legislature was kind of considering and looking at, they would have to really look at other sources of grants and funding to support this kind of development. So they need to, so in theory they're supposed to, but I think when you have these kind of different pressures, it's really challenging locally to figure out how to do that. And, that's something that cities are going to have to kind of grapple with and kind of go through as we keep kind of going down this route and see all this kind of development.
You said something a few minutes ago that hit home for me. One of the things that my city is working on is a community facilities district, and we're having stakeholder outreach meetings. One of the meetings that I attended, we had one property owner came and they said, well, wait a minute, I've owned that property for over 30 years, and I pay property tax and I pay sales tax. And I said, well, let's talk about Prop 13. If you want to, the initial finger is going to point at what the impact was to local agencies. For my agency, we get about 17 cents on the dollar. So your $10,000 property tax bill, we get a small fraction of that. So we need to use that to predominantly pay for core services, which doesn't leave us really anything to pay for the infrastructure and to maintain the infrastructure. And it's an education process, which I know Cal City is huge behind. And I think there's certainly a partnership with other organizations like CSMFO that to further educate our communities, but also our officials, because there's so much history. I mean, we were just talking before this started about the latest update to the revenue handbook. That has grown substantially over the last 15 years. So there's quite a bit to learn. It's why I think Cal Cities also offers training for newly elected officials. So much to learn, and it's such a rich history. But since housing is in your wheelhouse, you're quite busy.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's always a hot topic, and very of major interest. All our issue areas are major interest to our members, but I definitely feel like there has really been a very big focus on housing legislation really over the last decade or so, and it's always a challenge. And our local governments are trying to deal with just multiple competing priorities. I know we're going to talk about some of the other priorities of the state later today, but it's a challenge of trying to do that, balancing that with your community, and also trying to ensure that you have good quality of life for your residents. And that can be very challenging when you get these, streamlined by right laws. We used to be able to account for that stuff, and now we can't say no without a potential lawsuit or a potential fine or something like that, losing your housing elements and builder's remedy. There's a variety of factors, and local governments are doing their best to try to balance everything, and we're doing our best to help them out where we can in Sacramento.
I think it's a good segue to go to your colleague, Melissa. So we're going to shift over to CEQA reform. We're talking a little bit about Prop 4 with the climate bond. Everybody's favorite topic, cap and invest. So for our finance officers, this is not necessarily in their wheelhouse with CEQA, but can you kind of talk to us about the major reform to CEQA and how that might affect capital projects or the city's risk profiles?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really good segue between the housing conversation that we're having and other tools that the legislature is looking at to try and expedite, building more housing in the state of California. This year, as part of the major budget negotiations, there was actually major housing and CEQA reform, which is what we're going to talk about, which is AB 130 and SB 131. I think AB 130 got a lot more headline in the media if folks were paying attention to this housing and CEQA reform that was touted, right, and accomplished, which I'll dive into here. But I think there's actually a lot more potentially for cities to be focusing in on also SB 131, which got very little traction sort of in the news of all of these other types of potential CEQA exemptions that actually are more maybe geared towards local capital projects that could help our own jurisdictions with projects and things that we have. So what did these two bills do, and why were they so monumental? I think AB 130 focused in on housing development projects and creating a specific CEQA exemption for those projects. They are projects that have to be within urban areas, so in a incorporated municipality or in an urban area defined by the census. And so there's sort of two pathways there to look at where these types of housing developments can take place. And then there's specific site criteria and project criteria. Again, kind of getting back to how are we looking at development in our community? How can we streamline development in our community by not having to go through the full CEQA process in areas where there are already urban uses? And urban uses is one of those criteria defined in AB 130, has to be current or previously commercial or residential zoned, has to be surrounded by urban uses like transit, like parking, like retail, like other amenities in urban areas. And the bill really also prohibits certain sites from being used where the CEQA exemption would apply. And it really is that sort of nexus and overlap of considering housing in relation to climate risk. So sites that could not use the CEQA exemption would be areas where we have potential coastal sea level rise impacts and vulnerability in the very high fire severity zones, right? We shouldn't be waiving CEQA in areas where we do have greater climate risk, right? Or disaster risk, flood hazard areas along earthquake fault zone delineations. Like those are the exemptions within the exemption of this bill. So it's pretty complicated, but I think what it translates to is the legislature trying to find a pathway that's very specific, right, to help advance housing development projects without having to do CEQA. SB 131. Now, SB 131, again, I said got less kind of traction in the headlines in the media, but it actually, I think, does have a potential to provide some help to our jurisdictions as they're looking at their own local capital projects. So the bill did three major things. The first is it really actually tried to narrow the scope of the administrative record. So where local cities are lead agencies under CEQA, it tried to narrowly define more clearly what's considered part of the administrative record or not under CEQA in case of litigation. That could be a time savings potential, right, for our jurisdictions. It also allows for housing development projects that may have already been exempt under CEQA to actually, but except for one potential condition, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe there's some outstanding environmental concern on the project, but otherwise the project would be exempt. It allows for what's more of a focused environmental assessment to just address that single condition, so the housing development project could move through the CEQA process, but just in a little bit more of a streamlined fashion. I know I'm getting really deep into CEQA here, so you'll have to bear with me. The third part, which I think is really maybe the helpful part of SB 131, is it did provide additional project type by project type exemptions under CEQA. So things like any rezoning action that is consistent with your approved housing element doesn't have to go through the CEQA process. Disadvantaged community drinking water projects for public water systems, right? On-site sewer treatment, wastewater treatment projects, wildfire risk reduction projects. So that vegetation management that our cities are doing in and around their communities to keep them protected from wildfire. Those types of activities now are exempt under CEQA so long as they meet the criteria in the bill. We've had other cities that have had, issues with food pantries being permitted under and challenged under CEQA. Those are all now very clearly identified in the statute as exempt projects under CEQA. Again, what's the big takeaway? Well, that potential time saving, that potential litigation risk reduction there, right, could actually help advance really local projects that our cities really care about and are trying to improve our community and our quality of life. So there's some trade-offs there, right, to not have to go through the full robust CEQA process and to utilize some of these exemptions that are on the table.
I had many thoughts. One of the things you said, I believe, in terms of areas that are not subject to SB 1, is it SB 130?
AB 130 and
AB 130, SB 131.
Yeah.
Those that are in hazardous fire areas.
Yeah.
One thing that we probably did within the last 4 or 5 months, I think every agency they're required to review and adopt CAL FIRE's maps. Mm-hmm. Is that the standard that is being used to define what's in AB 130?
Yes, that's correct. They're using the state's designations for fire hazard severity zones, and there's a 3-tier ranking of very high, and moderate. And those very high fire severity zones, what that map that you adopted is telling you is what the environmental conditions are in and around your community in those areas that could potentially spread fire more rapidly. Mm-hmm. And I think the very high fire severity zone then comes with greater building code standard requirements, greater mitigation, defensible space requirements, right, to harden those communities so that they could withstand the potential of fire. And what's incorporated into 130 is that exemption, but saying you can't get out of the environmental analysis that the bill offers in those very high fire severity zones, right? That's an exception to the rule, right? You actually should be evaluating the environmental impact of those projects in those areas because of the very high fire risk. So fire is just one very, I think, salient topic that people are very focused on just after this year's catastrophic fires in Southern California. Yep. But the bill does include a provision in there for other types of disasters, right? We have so many cities that are impacted by different types of disaster type. And And that's my day-to-day, is talking to our cities about what's the type of disaster that you're dealing with and how can we help better create tools to plan for that. At least this measure acknowledged those disasters and those potential risks, and still, created this CEQA exemption to consider those, right?
I'm curious, in the county that I work in and live in, it's largely infill development. Like it's not like Lathrop, right? Where there were 10,000 acres of land that used to be farm, but now are ready can be developed. And talking to a lot of my colleagues around the San Francisco Peninsula, the areas that are available for redevelopment are former landfills. So are former landfills kind of subject to this one of the environmental outs, effectively?
Yeah, there is a specific reference to hazardous waste sites. I would assume that landfills would be considered in that definition and that criteria. That is one of the exceptions to the rule, so to speak, in the bill. There's also additional language around hazardous waste site assessments that they've modified in the measure. And I will say, these two bills came together very quickly through a lot of the budget process, actually, this year. And so it was atypical to have such robust policy as part of the budget, right? Passage in June. Yeah. And what we can anticipate going into next year, my advice for cities is to really understand what's in AB 130 and SB 131, understand how it could apply in your community or not, but also know that there might be potential changes coming to CEQA in this next year so what the legislature uses the term is to clean up, right, the legislation that they just passed. Yeah. So there might be more conversations around these particular vehicles, and changes that might be made in addition to these.
One rabbit hole question and then one promotional opportunity. Are areas that are close to fault zones also do they have an exemption?
Yes, yes, that's included. In fact, we put together a primer on AB 130 and a primer on SB 131. There are 2 pages for each bill, so it's not a long read. It's much shorter than the bill itself, but we give you those statutory references in the primer, so you can go back and really dig in and see what are those specific site criteria, project criteria that would apply in our jurisdiction, and again, like, how would it apply? What are those potential implications there for a potential development to happen in those areas?
The second, and you kind of give a little tease there, is Cal Cities has a primer on these 2 pieces of legislation. And I did see through the city manager's listserv that you're also going to be doing a presentation on 707 coming up relatively soon. But are there, related to either housing or CEQA, are there other trainings that are coming up in the near future for our members and their colleagues to be able to attend or watch?
Absolutely. I feel like we, in addition to all the advocacy that we do throughout the year with the legislature in particular on transformative legislation like this, we also have about 13 other conferences that we host year round. So whether it's your city attorneys or your public works officers or your planning department staff, we host programs and sessions that go over a lot of this emerging legislation, so that they can really understand, and digest and talk about city-specific examples, right? So we really try to feature a lot of those programs to be very relevant on these late-breaking and emerging topics that our cities are going to have to deal with.
Let's go back to finance officers who love funding opportunities. Prop 4, the climate bond. There are some opportunities for our agencies to be able to access those. What are some words of wisdom that you have about trying to prepare to potentially access those? And there's probably some matching requirements behind that.
Yeah, and I hope that our finance officers really do take away an opportunity here, right? I think that's the biggest thing. Prop 4, the passage of Prop 4 last year, November 2024, the voters approved Proposition 4, $10 billion for climate funding. That's broken into 8 different chapters, and within those chapters are a whole host of programs, some existing programs, some new programs that the state operates. So that $10 billion is money that's available, right? It's money that the voters have said, yes, we want to dedicate it to those purposes. And when we talk about the 8 different chapters, it's things like what we're talking about. Water supply, your public water systems, your water supply infrastructure, wildfire resilience, coastal resilience funding, creating community centers for extreme heat or extreme weather events, disaster fairgrounds, things like that, like bolstering those types of facilities in our communities. It includes things like also nature-based solutions and other conservation programs, smart agriculture, sustainable agricultural funding for more rural communities, and then energy, right? There are these big buckets, right, that each have dedicated amounts of funding. Mm-hmm. So whatever the priority is for your city, I guarantee there's $1 in there for you, right? So try, again, it's another thing to dig into, but it's available money, and it's available money now that could really be leveraged for your city's priorities when it comes to climate or disaster preparedness. I will say, again, this was one of the late-breaking things with the legislature at the end of the legislative session. We went through the budget process, and they chose to actually put off the passage and the allocation of the first climate bond dollars in the typical budget cycle. And so it was actually what we call a budget trailer bill that gets carried at the very end of the legislative session. And so this was in the final week that a $3.3 billion budget trailer bill dropped so that we could allocate the first third of the $10 billion climate bond. It took a lot of advocacy and a lot of groups saying the same thing to really make that happen. Cal Cities, we were among those groups trying to say these dollars are available. Why not allocate them this year, right? There's no reason to withhold that money. And again, for our cities, I say in my day-to-day, I'm flooded with these conversations of, we have this project. I had a conversation a couple weeks ago. We have more housing development than our sewer system has capacity for. How do we expand that project, right? Like how do we leverage money to do that? This is that opportunity. And Cal Cities put together a Prop 4 guide when it was going to the ballot, and it really breaks down those 8 chapters into what programs are going to basically have dedicated amounts of funding. So you can go in, you can see the program, the state agency, the dollar amount that's going to be available over the next 3 to 5 years is the spending plan that the state has said they'd like to administer this funding. And then also we put in the program's purpose and the website so that our cities can go to those web pages and really dig into the criteria. Yes, some programs may have certain matching requirements, like you mentioned. Yep. It's just going to vary depending on the program. But for the most part, this is real funding that could be leveraged for real projects that we know our cities have. So we're very encouraging of our cities to take advantage of it. In fact, the first allocation, the $3.3 billion, we created a searchable spreadsheet. So you can go in and you can find the budget line item that and program funding that you're looking for to really know, what's the directive in that budget language for how that money's going to be allocated. So those tools are all available to our cities, and we hope it's something that both finance officers and our public works staff are digging into to get a better sense of how can we take advantage of that money.
One of the things I was thinking about specifically for Prop 4, I just don't know in terms of allocation and weighting, WEIGHTING. Is there an equity component? Like if there are disadvantaged communities or underserved communities, do they get extra weight towards them to get a little bit more
Yes. So there might be specifics for specific programs that will be in the bond language, and that'll be something we call out in the guide. Overall, with Prop 4, there was a target. I believe 40% of the bond is intended for servicing disadvantaged, underserved communities in the state. The Natural Resources Agency at the state is going to be tracking all of the bond dollars. That's part of the state's bond accountability. And so they will be measuring that metric over time. So each program may have some portion or set aside for more vulnerable communities that can utilize that funding. So there is that in there, and that's called out in our guide. You'll see that up front. Yeah.
And transitioning to another funding opportunity, it's the Cap and Invest program. It's a reauthorization. What does that mean for our members and finance officers in terms of opportunity?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks think about, this California has the Cap and Trade program, what we've called it to date, now Cap and Invest, and they think, okay, that's a program that doesn't really relate to local governments, and maybe it's about high emitting businesses, and it doesn't really relate to us, right? And in fact, I know cities that have actually benefited from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is tied to the Cap and Trade program, and they didn't even know that it was coming from this broader program. So it is something that did get also a lot of headline this last year as one of the major climate deals that the legislature and the governor were negotiating. The Cap and Trade, now Cap and Invest, was reauthorized, which means they've extended the program from 2030 through 2045. A couple of reasons why they did that, but there was some thought about aligning this program with our overall, the state's carbon neutrality goals, make sure we're lining up our goals with the funding that we have, but also because the market started to dip, and over the last year, the carbon market was in a pretty downward trend, just due to the instability of the program. And so this reauthorization kind of infused that stability back into the overall market for the program. I would say the piece that we advocated on, and the piece that's important for our cities to know about, is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. This is where all of that money from high emitting businesses gets auctioned and priced, and that money then sits in the state's special fund, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And that fund basically it's dedicated for a variety of program areas. And one of the things that they reconfigured with the reauthorization is how should we apportion the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund monies. There's a large portion of the fund that previously served affordable housing and sustainable communities projects, almost 20%. A large portion of the fund is also dedicated to the high-speed rail. And so these were the negotiations going on this year between the governor and the legislature, both houses, to say, how should we reconfigure this fund? Well, I think the key thing for cities, again, at the highest level to take away is really to know that there are specific call-outs for affordable housing and sustainable communities. While that might not be a city grant, it might be something that is done in your city, right? And that is really important for your city from an affordable housing perspective. I know I've talked to a lot of cities that say, yeah, we weren't the grant recipient, but we had partners, right, that helped win those grants and develop more affordable housing for our city. There's also funding set aside for transit and intercity rail. So for our more urban areas, there's more rail funding. There's air pollution protection program funding. There's also a new call out specifically for forest health and wildfire prevention program funding, and then safe drinking water. That's where, for the last 10 years or so, that's where our safe drinking water funding has generated from, is from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So you may, as a city, be a part of these state programs where you're receiving grants or funding, and it is in fact coming from GGRF. The one new piece here is that the legislature, it's more distinctly called out in their framework now that the legislature has $1 billion, so long as it's generated, in discretionary funding on the annual budget cycle. So there's money that can go towards climate prevention or disaster preparedness type projects that have some type of a nexus with greenhouse gas emission savings. That's really what this program is intended for. And we see a real opportunity there for cities to have a lot more money dedicated for climate and disaster related work through the GGRF. We think that's a very well-intended use of those funds to help cities manage, plan, and prepare and invest, in the next climate disaster that might hit their city. So that's really the key takeaway. The new framework is going to be implemented this next fiscal year. So again, I think there's going to be a lot of talk about how this is now actually going to get implemented.
One quick tangent question, because you mentioned, I think it was one of the last categories about the greenhouse gas fund, is it can be used for, did you say clean water or water, kind of clean water safety?
Drinking water, yep.
Would that include kind of purple pipe projects?
Our Safe Drinking Water program is really intended for ensuring water supply. So in times of drought, in times of or water quality concerns, right? You have water, but it's not safe to drink. That's really what the Safe Drinking Water program is for.
Okay.
If you're interested in purple pipe or recycled water projects, I would look to Prop 4. There's a dedicated water chapter, what we just talked about in the climate bond. There's a dedicated water chapter. There's a dedicated section on recycled water funding for those types of projects. Again, it's navigating these sources that are now available that our cities can take advantage of.
The reason I asked is my last agency, they had just finished a $1 billion clean water program. And as a part of that, they're Title 22 compliant. But it kind of positions them in the future if they do want to do a purple pipe program. And I remember talking to the former public works director about it, and she said, well, it positions us, but to actually build out the infrastructure for purple pipe it's so exorbitant.
Yeah. So,
perhaps Prop 4 might be a source of funding to kind of make that happen.
It could, yeah, I definitely think it could be. Might not suffice the full project cost, but this is where hopefully our cities can get creative about what's out there and what's available. And again, the Prop 4 is pretty near term, where the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is extended through 2045. That's a long-term funding source now that's on the table. Prop 4 is in the next 3 to 5 years, and we've seen climate bonds, water bonds come back, almost regularly. It feels like, to continue that need, to continue articulating that need to the state and to the legislature. So there's always more, I know there's always more funding than there is dollar available, but we're hopeful that the tools we're putting together to help navigate some of these are helping cities just like that, better position for their water supply needs in the future.
What would you, and this will be my final question for you, what are some key takeaways for our finance officers that are trying to budget around uncertainty with climate or environmental funding? Maybe like top 3 key takeaways for you.
Yeah, I would say generally, I think, really understand what your priorities are for your city. That's going to help you then better leverage the available funding that is out there. I think we're fortunate right now with the state that state of California is prioritizing climate-related funding, maybe less from other sources. We've seen philanthropic areas dwindle. We've seen federal funding dwindle. So it's like lean into where you see the dollars available and really try to leverage that as best you can, but also know like what are your true priorities. And I talk to cities a lot about, we have this greater risk, right, with disaster or flood or fire or sea level rise impacts and coastal erosion. Well, if that disaster were to hit, your city would be in a totally different financial situation, right, to manage the disaster. So really try to get your arms around those priorities and then, use the dollars that are there now as best you can. And we're fortunate there are dollars on the table for climate planning and projects right now. So we're hopeful our cities are really going to be able to use them.
One anecdote that when you said coastal areas, it was a few months ago during the summer. I think there was a massive earthquake in Russia, and the tsunami alerts started to hit everybody's phone.
Yeah.
My colleagues in cities in the coastal area, there's literally 2 ways out of town. And when the tsunami alert hit, it was gridlock. I mean, there was no place that people could go. I mean, I think there's 30,000 people all trying to get out at the same time.
Yeah.
So if there's using these resources and these dollars to kind of address climate change and the impacts that it's going to have on residents and communities, especially in coastal areas, I think is key for them.
Absolutely. It's this intersection between Ben, Brady, and I, right? It's like how you're planning in your community, like how you can leverage other sources of revenue, and like how are you confronting the real climate risks that are in front of you for your community. I think it's like this really interesting nexus, but I think this year in particular, we saw it play out with Los Angeles and just how catastrophic those fires were. Yep. And knowing the amount of mutual aid that came in and all of the support, right? And again, like disaster will devastate a community, not just physically, but financially, really. And so being prepared for that, right? Were any of us prepared for that tsunami alert? We were at an event along the coast, and we got that alert too, and we weren't prepared, right? So just knowing and thinking about what's that next, and what's that major priority climate risk for your city. It's probably not all of those things, but maybe it's one of those, right? Yeah. And I talked to cities up in the North Coast about earthquakes, and then I talked to Southern California cities about coastal erosion, and it's a different disaster in different parts of the state, but I think it's smart to really think beyond just the day-to-day, and what could that potential risk look like, and how do we help mitigate that? Yeah.
So I'm going to give a transition to Ben, and we saved the best for last.
I don't like following Melissa.
I'm not saying that because you're the staff liaison to the Revenue and Tax Committee, which I'm on, but so this is more near and dear to our finance officers' hearts. We're going to talk about local revenue tools, transparency, SB 346. What are some of the more notable ones that you've brought up during committee that our finance officers should know about?
I mean, I think I'd start, with the state budget. I think that's typically the largest lift in the legislature. And while, it's not necessarily local revenues, it does impact every single Californian. The state's budget has been quite the roller coaster the last few years, to, put it lightly. It was only a couple years ago we had that $90 billion on paper surplus, and I stress on paper because those dollars never hit state our coffers. But then we dramatically swung to about a $30 billion deficit, and then it was about $47 billion the year after that. And this last year we bridged, I believe, about a $12 billion deficit. It's not getting much better, and it's for a few different reasons. We have a very progressive tax structure here in California. We rely a lot on the top 1% of earners, capital gains, and so we're uniquely susceptible to swings in the stock market. And the governor really put that on the table when he put his budget proposal out, especially during the May revision. Our revenues were up, so everyone was expecting hey, we're not going to have a deficit, but he kind of put it laid at the feet of the feds. And he's like, hey, we have, trade wars, we have, tariffs, and, our economy, like our industries can't sustain that. And because we project our revenues like on a 12-month basis, like we have no clue how much money is going to be coming in. And because of that, it's difficult to project how much you want to spend. But despite all that, our budget grew $20 billion. So it's interesting, and we made it through. We always do. We find a way to pass a balanced budget. Even with that $12 billion deficit, we only managed about $2 to $3 billion worth of cuts. The LAO just came out yesterday with their projection for the next couple of years. I don't know if you took a look at it, but we're about $18 billion for next year. Even though our revenues are coming in, above expectations, but Prop 98, Prop 2, constitutional commitments are locking those revenues in, and then we're staring about $30 billion a year, going forward. And so there's gonna be some difficult decisions for the next gubernatorial administration that comes in, and legislative leadership. The new Senate Pro Tem, Senator Lamone, she's going to have some difficult decisions and working with the Speaker of the Assembly. So it's going to be interesting times ahead on that front. But I say all that because it's typically the lens that the legislature looks at as they kind of come into the year, and as they approach legislation. Because as bills progress throughout the process, they have to go through the fiscal committee, and oftentimes when the legislature puts a price tag on a bill, it's within the lens of, can we support this bill through the budget? So I say all that. There were a handful of fiscal bills. I'm sorry, they weren't giving us money in my portfolio. They were trying to take your money. But there were a few that that were noteworthy. First one I want to talk about was AB 330, and this is a wonky little bill. The local prepaid mobile telephony service collection act. I did not know this program existed until this year, but I guess we can. I learned this year we can apply utility user taxes to prepaid mobile services. It was up for sunset review and extension, and so this program comes up every 5 years for renewal. Usually it's rubber stamped. It's kind of smooth sailing. This year it was kind of like that. Republicans laid off. They abstained. A couple of them voted no because the word tax was in the bill. But we had over 100 cities that have these revenue streams, and while it's not like a property tax revenue stream, it's not massive. We're not in the business of leaving anything on the table. Times are tough for us too, just like the state. And so we were able to get that one through. No amendments on the bill, so it went from the Senate or the Assembly to the Senate, straight to the governor's desk. I want to thank Assemblymember Rogers for that, former Cal Cities alumni. So thank him for carrying that one for one of his first bills. A couple, and I know we're going to talk about SB 346 later, so I won't dive into that one now, but some of the bills too that affect local agencies aren't necessarily always ones we take positions on, because we're able to get amendments along the way, so we don't have to necessarily take public facing positions. But one that caught my eye this year that was up for renewal was the rooftop solar property tax exemption that was up for renewal. It was SB 710 by Senator Blake Spear, and this is a property tax exemption that's been on the books for since probably the late 80s or so. So it's been around for a long time. But this year it kind of caught our eye, and then also our friends over at the county associations as well, in that the legislature was really focusing on data centers this year, and solar farms. And so our red flags went up, like, wait, hey, we're having a property tax exemption for solar, and there's no restrictions on who would qualify, the size of a project. And I started thinking, well, when this thing came about in the 80s, they probably never contemplated the concept of a data center and how much energy this thing would be using with solar, and same thing with solar farms. And so we were able to negotiate into the bill, initially as it was coming out of the Senate into the Assembly, a 5 megawatt cap into the size of the exemption that was allowed. And then actually the Assembly Revenue and Taxation Committee took that cap and reduced it even further to a 1 megawatt cap. And then coming out of appropriations, just going back to the budget and the tough times we're in, because even though property tax is local, any dollar that comes out of the school share property tax has to be backfilled from the state's general fund because of Prop 98. They took out any new property tax exemptions for solar as a whole. And it's just, you pretty much, anything you have to have that built by 2027 to qualify for the exemption. All the old ones stay on the books, but no new ones after 2027. So goodbye to that subsidy. Yeah. So that was an interesting one. Additional one was SB 86. Senator McNerney carried that. It was and I'm going to read it because I don't want to get the title wrong, the California Alternative Energy and Advanced Transportation Financing Authority. A great wonky government term, the state does it right. This is a program in the state treasurer's office. This has been around, again, for a few decades. It was hardly used until the Schwarzenegger administration. This was actually one of the programs that was seed money for Tesla. I think it was around $12 million or so that Schwarzenegger awarded the Tesla. It's a sales and use tax credit that advanced manufacturing and technology companies can use. Green energy projects, they can get sales and use tax exemption for their inputs for their projects. It was similar to the solar property tax exemption. It was up for renewal. Happens every 5 years. Right now, the statutory authority for that program is $100 million a year. That's the amount for the sales and use tax exemption. Well, Senator McNerney wanted to indefinitely extend this program and then raise the number to $300 million a year.
Wow.
So we opposed that right out the gate. We opposed that bill. It's like, all right, well, we're giving away more local money and on an indefinite basis. Eventually, we got that. They put the sunset date back into the bill, so they only re-upped it for 2 years, and then they reduced it back down to that $100 million, the existing authority as well. So we were able to remove our opposition to that one. And then there's a couple other notable bills along the way that were actually stopped. The first one was AB 698 by Assemblymember Wicks. This one deals with property transfer taxes, everyone's favorite topic this year apparently. And that one said if you are a charter city and you're looking to put a property transfer tax on the ballot, you need to do a study on how that property transfer tax is going to impact affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And once you do that study, you need to mail that study along with the ballot to your voters. So imagine your postage costs in November. Luckily, we were able to secure amendments to that bill to remove the mailing of the study out, and you just have to post the study onto your website. That bill was ultimately held in the Senate Rules Committee, so it's parked, not going anywhere. And then another one was SB 789 by Senator Menjivar. This would have created a statewide vacancy tax on commercial properties of $5 per square foot. And yeah, so you, Rich, South San Francisco, you have a nice property there. We're going to come in, we're going to tax you $5 a square foot, and that money will not be going back into your community. That will be coming into state coffers. Thank you for doing business. So that's just a handful of the kind of the notable ones I wanted to flag for folks. It's again, it's not always the ones that get across the finish lines. It's the ones that we kind of make better along the way, or hopefully stop along the way.
So I have a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
The first one is a pop quiz.
Oh boy.
Okay. Cal Cities puts out, I think it's Michael Coleman kind of compilates the election results, after every election. I went back and looked, and this is going back to, I think, the year 2000. How have utility users' taxes, new or expanded, how have they performed at the ballot box?
Not as well, because they are more of a regressive tax.
In terms of percentage, do you know what it is?
He told me this on not too long ago. It was above, I hope you're not listening, Michael. I believe it was above 50% for below, but expanding them or what they apply to passes at a better rate versus a new tax, if I remember correctly.
I didn't differentiate between new or expansion. I just did both. Okay. But it was 32%.
Wow. Okay.
It was, I think, of all of the tax forms that I looked at, it was performed the worst.
Because I know that transactions and use taxes are passing at very, very high rates. Yep. TOT, similar. But yeah, UUTs I know are some of the bottom of the barrel in terms of when they pass.
And you mentioned, I think it was the McHenry bill that was the sales tax exemption. Is that sales and use only, or is it also transactions and use tax?
Sales and use only.
Okay. Let's talk about SB 346.
All right.
Now, I was thinking about this, and in the cities that I've worked for, and if you look at the municipal code, it does give them audit authority, right? Now, typically, especially in the smaller to mid-sized agencies, they just don't have the resources to actually do the audit. They're relying on consultants to do that for them. And especially even smaller agencies. Well, first, I want you to give a background on it, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, so SB 346 was a bill that Cal Cities sponsored this year, along with the California Association of Treasurers and County Treasurers and Tax Collectors. It's kind of funny. This one was brought up to me by one of our city managers. He told me, he's like, "Hey, have you ever heard about how we get TOT from the short-term rental platforms?" And I will not use the terminology he told me. He essentially said you get a bag of money in a alleyway from them, and you're told to trust them, trust that it's the correct amount of money and it came from the right and legal sources.
Yep.
So with that in mind, and knowing that some of our cities have been struggling with the, where to identify short-term rentals, whether they're, legal or illegally operating, we drafted this bill, which essentially does a couple different things. First, it's an opt-in bill, so it's, pro-local control. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. But what you can do is you can adopt an ordinance that says you can request from the short-term rental, so your company, so Airbnb, VRBO, they will have, at your request, they will have to send you the address of all the short-term rentals that are operating within your jurisdiction. The idea being is that once you have that address, you can compare it to your business licenses that you have on file. So you'll match up those addresses to the business licenses, so you'll know those are the legally operating short-term rentals. What you're left with are going to be the addresses of the ones that don't have a business license on file. Therefore, you're going to know who has been and who has not been paying TOT in your community. The second part is it's for situations where the platforms are collecting the TOT on behalf of the hosts and remitting it to the city. In those situations, our cities are in what's called a voluntary collection agreement with the platforms, and I have had the pleasure of reading through a couple of those, and woo boy. Essentially, when you do those, you're almost signing away your entire audit authority over TOT. You're basically being told you'll get no information about the properties of where this TOT came from. My favorite one that I saw was that the platforms allow the host to opt out of the VCAs on the back end. So not only as a city are you not knowing where it's coming from, the hosts on the back end are allowed to opt out, so you don't even know who is a part of the VCA. So our bill says in those scenarios, we now have audit authority over the platforms. So that's at its core what the bill does.
You beat me to asking my question, because that's what I was thinking of was were cities that already have the agreement with platforms like Airbnb that, and you said it better than I would, which is it's a no questions asked. Here's your money, go away. So this bill now gives the authority for cities to see the addresses. And I'm thinking from an enforcement perspective, right? You have short-term rentals that are in your city. You probably, your code enforcement officers are busy, right? If you now have a more comprehensive list from the platforms of where those are, that better informs the city to better enforce the requirement. So thank you, Cal Cities.
You're welcome. No, it was a very difficult bill to carry. There was a lot of fierce opposition from the platforms on there, but we had a very robust support campaign behind the bill. We had labor, we had Brady's friends, the Cal Yimby behind the bill. We had the LA Biz Fed, and pretty much cities from up and down the state behind the bill, and so it made it was a strong push, but a lot of work, but we got it across the finish line, and we're looking forward to seeing the return on investment on it. We want to see TOT coming back into our communities, because really we have massive tourism events coming to the state of California in the next few years, so we want to make sure that cities are capitalizing on that. The state's not in the business of giving us money, so let's use the tools that are already at our disposal.
I was curious, for SB 346, did the state or Cal Cities come up with a projection of how much additional revenue would likely be generated as a result of it?
So we worked a little bit with some of our league partners, specifically over at Deckard Technologies, some of those firms that contract with cities to kind of hunt down the illegal short-term rentals. I use that term lightly. But the number we kept coming up with, there's typically around 25 to 30% illegal short-term rental activity. Wow. And so really you're going to have to look at it jurisdiction by jurisdiction. What's your TOT rate, and then you kind of apply that. So back of the napkin math. But the one example we kept seeing was when we were in the Senate Local Government Committee, the county treasurer tax collector from Lake County came down to testify, and he was talking about how he got one of these contractors to come in. They got the service, they got all the addresses. They had over 50% of the short-term rentals in Lake County were illegally operating. And so he paid $10,000. They paid the county. I think they said paid $10,000 for their software. Yeah. They had a guy come in with a $10,000 check.
Wow.
He was like, I didn't know.
Yeah.
And so it paid for itself. And so we're hoping that we can keep track of all the ordinances that pop up under 346, because we want to track to see if we have an uptick in TOT like we think we will.
Let's shift over to another piece of legislation, SB 595. that talks about local financial reporting and investment flexibility. How should our finance officers and their respective agencies prepare for these new deadlines or options?
Don't hold it against me. I used to work at the state controller's office, so I'm very familiar with financial transaction reports and reporting. This bill is essentially the stay off the state controller's naughty list bill. Really, it did start out, it didn't actually used to have everything in it that it did when it went into print originally. Originally, it was just you have 10 months to get your financial transaction report in. And so we didn't actually position on this bill because it was enough that we were working with the staff a little bit behind the scenes to be like, okay, what can we do to massage this, make it a little bit better? We knew the controller's office was working with them as well. And so I really kind of wanted to get the, the perspective, like, why are we running this bill? Like, what's not working in existing law? And, come to find out, there's a handful of cities every year, for whatever reason, just aren't getting their financial transaction reports in time. But in speaking with the controller's office, their current process is, if you don't get it in by the due date, they're going to send you the nastygram letter of saying, hey, why don't you have your financial transaction report in? Then typically once that letter comes in, the non-compliance rate significantly drops. And then when you get you're really, really late, then the non-compliance rate drops even farther, and then you're left with a couple jurisdictions that haven't reported it. So it's like, is this bill really kind of a solution in search of a problem, or what are we getting at here? And so ultimately, I think the controller got the amendments in there to say upon discretion of the controller, so it's not so much just that hard stop of 10 months, which I think is beneficial for cities, because oftentimes there's probably a good reason why the financial transaction report isn't turned in. There could be a staffing capacity issue, or there could be just for whatever reason it's not ready on time. I would like to think that we're not nefariously just not turning these documents in on time. We have our own kind of GASB standards that we have to meet. We're not just sitting on these reports. So I appreciate the discretion being put into the bill. The investment piece, this was kind of a unique thing. This was brought to our attention about midway through the year that this investment authority was expiring, and now. Yeah, that's in the bill. It was set to sunset on January 1, 2026. And so not many agencies really utilize the investment authority that's in the bill. And I'm not licensed to investments, so this is not advice or anything like that. But we tried to get this into what's called a committee bill, which are typically, they're run by like the local government committee or the Revenue and Taxation committee. They're not authored by a senator or an assembly member. They're non-controversial. They can't have any opposition. It's pretty much they have to be clean. They just go straight through. For whatever reason, the committee didn't want to carry this. We thought it'd be simple and easy enough. Luckily, Dr. Choi, who was running this bill, was like, I'll put it in the bill. And so we're like, great. And then the counties wanted to increase on the duration of some of the commercial paper that they can invest in. Because I guess the SEC allows them to invest in certain paper that's a little bit longer in duration. State statute didn't quite align with that. And so they bumped that number up. Again, there was no opposition to the bill. I don't think it received a single no vote. And so I think at the end of the day, it kind of turned into a good government transparency bill. And if it makes a difference with, more compliance at the state controller's office, great. I still think, looking through some of their numbers that they, post of who doesn't comply, I think a lot of it comes down to like some of the special districts that have off fiscal years. That seems to be kind of where they have some of the issues, in some of those smaller districts that don't really have much staff, or like their revenues are so small. It's like they don't think they have to report. So, but yeah, I mean, I thought that was a pretty interesting bill that kind of cobbled together a few different pieces.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you used to work for the state controller's office. What years were you there?
I started there in 2019, and I worked there through the beginning of 2023. So I was there for Betty's second term as controller, and I was her assistant deputy controller for legislation.
So I think that was after they made the change. So if I'm remembering correctly, what the timing of the state controller's report, it didn't work out well with when cities typically issued their ACFR. Mm-hmm. So the numbers that were coming in were not actual. They were kind of a projection. Mm-hmm. So then they changed the timing to say, okay, let's make this actually work. So you can actually use your audited financial numbers. The reason I was asking you what years you were there, this goes back to the redevelopment days when you would submit a separate report specifically for RDA. God, what year was this? This was like 2008 or 9, if I remember right. I want you to take a guess of what application they used to submit the report. All agencies that had a redevelopment agency, this was roughly 2008, 2009. What application do you think it was?
Carrier pigeon.
You're not far off.
A fax machine.
It was an Access 92 model. I still have nightmares about that.
See you twitching over there.
So we're kind of gearing up for the 2026 election, and I'm curious, what you're kind of seeing in terms of local revenue measures. You mentioned sales tax. What are some other regional priorities and things that Cal Cities is seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think sales tax is the big one, the most common one. This year was interesting. There were three measures in the legislature that were looking to exceed the 2% cap between the city and county rate for the transactions and use tax. So that's what I always find interesting is that, we talk about the legislature really focused on affordability this year. That was kind of their theme and their mantra. We have these, every single year we have these bills to kind of go above and beyond what we deem as like the limit of what our sales taxes should be. And I looked it up earlier this year, and it was close to 45% of the state lives within an exemption to the TUT law. And so when you think about it, is 2% the right number? Should it be 2.5? Is it 3? Is 2 an arbitrary number? I don't know. But it always gets me thinking the unnecessary competition sometimes between cities and counties to gobble up that 2%. But this year in particular, it was a little bit nastier, I'd say, than normal to kind of get those bills across the finish line. Obviously, we don't advocate for those city specific or region specific ones, but typically, the Republicans will just lay off those bills. There was a little bit more opining on them this year, and then even the governor waited till the last day of session to sign them, and he put a signing statement out with them. And it was the same statement for all three bills, but I thought that was noteworthy, that he did that. And so if that's kind of a sign of times to come, I would just advise cities that if you're looking to go to get an exemption to the TUT law, be strategic about it and don't just wait till the last second. Don't be haphazard about it. Really, be strategic about this. It might not be this governor to be the one, you might want to wait till, 2027 to do it. So yeah, that was one thing that caught my eye. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more TOT increases or more TOTs hit the ballot. Again, we mentioned the Olympics, World Cup coming up. I've heard a lot that especially down in the LA region, areas that haven't had TOT are going to be putting them up. They want to capitalize. Makes total sense to me. And then one thing I'd keep my eye on too is I think we're starting to see more and more of the upland type measures hitting the ballot. And I think we've heard kind of varying levels of comfort with that from our membership, because I think some, councils view it as kind of taking away, the kind of authority from them. You have less control. It's a special tax too, which I know, he's mentioning Michael Coleman. I think everyone knows his opinion on special taxes and, versus a general tax. And yeah, and so in the kind of the heartburn that the upland type measures bring as well with the business community. So I think those are the type of things that I'm going to be looking for kind of moving forward in 2026. And then also we have the Jarvis measure out there as well, which I'm happy to chat about if you want to kind of go down that rabbit hole.
That's one of my favorite rabbit holes to go down. So I think they've had at least a couple of versions. And I think the principal things in my mind, thereafter, they want to reverse the upland decision. I know that. They also want to eviscerate, the real property transfer tax. I think I wouldn't have such heartburn about it if it were forward-looking. But because it wants to go retroactive effectively on ones that have already been in place for years. Let's start with their efforts. And they're not the only taxpayers and Taxpayers Association that wants to target the upland decision, but let's get into the weeds on that. The very first Revenue Tax Committee meeting we had earlier this year, they had submitted 1 or 2 versions, but at that time they really didn't have any support in terms of financial. And they've had a couple of revisions since that time. But love to hear, this is your wheelhouse. I'd love to hear from you about it.
Yeah, it's been a winding road. Just when you think you've kind of wrapped your mind around it, there's another version of it that comes out. But yeah, they've had the third version has been cleared for gathering signatures. So that's what they're doing right now. But to kind of get to that point, what they had to do is they had to submit it to the Attorney General's office, and then the LAO does their fiscal analysis of the measure. And I think they marked it at couple $1 billion of lost revenues to the local government, obviously to those cities that have the property transfer taxes, as well as I believe there are a couple counties, a school district as well, and one special district that would have impacts. And then obviously future looking, every single city is going to have an impact in one way, shape, or form. One, you're not going to be able to put a property transfer tax on the ballot. So, every single charter city is going to have that impact. And then also there's going to be no more use of the upland route to have anything on the ballot. And so, they have the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association has until I believe late February to qualify the measure. I think they need to get around 1 million signatures or so. And so, we're about mid to late November right now. We haven't gotten any kind of update from the Secretary of State about where they're at with the signatures yet. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. But it'll be curious to see. It's, I think we're going to have the similar kind of players in this ballpark that we have traditionally had. So yeah, keep your eyes open. This will be something that we'll be monitoring very carefully. And I'm sure the next Revenue and Taxation Policy Committee will have another update.
So I was thinking back over the last 7 years, a different taxpayers association, the CBRT, they had their effort in 2018 and then again in 2023. In 2018, it was then Governor Brown who and Cal Cities that worked together to say, okay, what are you really after, right? And it was Coke and Pepsi that said, okay, we're mad about the soda tax. So I forget, what was it, 2032 that the ban is still goes into effect?
That sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of ameliorated them. And I remember, monitoring it, and I told myself, yeah, they're going to be back. Mm-hmm. So it was no surprise when they resurfaced again in 2023. But I think you're absolutely right. It feels like there's being efforts to subvert local government's efforts to actually function from these types of entities. And that's where I feel like the partnership with Cal Cities is absolutely critical, because this is your everyday, right? I don't have the time or energy to monitor what's happening at the state level and with these taxpayers associations. So I just wanted to give credit to Cal Cities for monitoring these for us.
I appreciate that, and just kind of give you a peek behind the curtain of just the craziness of the last few days of the legislative session. So the legislature has 72 hours to put a bill into print before it can be voted upon. So really you have 3 days until the end of session to get your last bill into print if you want to do something before the end of the year. So knowing the Jarvis initiative was out there, the weekend, or maybe it was 2 weeks before the end of session, there was rumors circulating that there was going to be a legislative play to kind of preempt the Jarvis initiative and maybe make some reforms around property transfer taxes. And so we got our hands on some language, and that was floating around. And essentially, it would have, I think it was a 15-year exemption from property transfer taxes on commercial properties, contingent upon the Jarvis measure not qualifying for the ballot. It was statewide, attempted to be retroactive. The drafting was a little bit all over the place, but there was multiple versions of the language floating around. And I think it shows the legislature does not have an interest in the Jarvis measure being on the ballot. Clearly they don't want it there. I think it shows the legislature has an interest in reining in property transfer taxes to some extent. The Jarvis initiative, the Business Roundtable initiative seem to be, targeted at Measure ULA in Los Angeles. I don't think that's a mystery to anyone. And so I think we have to be, cities as a whole, if you're preparing to do a property transfer tax, or if you have one, I think need to kind of start thinking of, if this is on the table, What can we potentially live with? What does a future of a property transfer tax look like? We know we have the guardrails of what a general law city can apply, in terms of their documentary transfer tax.
Right.
But what does it look like for charter cities? And and I think the cities should start thinking about that versus the legislature making that decision for them. And eventually, that bill kind of went into print. And luckily, we were able to kind of work with some of our cities, behind the scenes, get some phone calls made. It got turned into a LA only bill. Bill ended up getting pulled, and conversations are still kind of ongoing, But I don't think this is over with. This is this is a topic that is, how do I put it? When you have studies coming out of UCLA talking about how property transfer taxes are negatively impacting affordable housing and property taxes, I think that's going to pop. The ears are going to pop up in the legislature, and so they're going to look for reform. And that's not going to be just in LA. Right. It's going to be a one-size-fits-all approach.
I have one more question on the Howard Jarvis initiative. So I think it was two parts, the real property transfer tax and then the upland decision. My recollection from 2023 with the CBRT was that was it ACA 10 or ACA 5 that basically said, hey, if you're going to undo this 2/3 requirement for citizens initiatives, then you're also subject to the same level of approval. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't the Howard Jarvis initiative also be subject to the same level of approval?
So that was ACA 13.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a fun one to muscle through the legislature. In theory, yes. If they both appear on the same ballot, I believe the one that has the higher vote total would be the one that would prevail. And so let's say ACA 13 gets one more vote than the Howard Jarvis measure, then the Jarvis measure would have to pass by 2/3. But vice versa, if the Jarvis measure received one more vote than ACA 13, would not. At least that's my understanding. You can get into the legal theory of having severability clauses in there, and then I'm a lobbyist. I'm not a lawyer. It takes a 4-year degree and a $100 check to the Secretary of State's office. So I would say again, consult someone much brighter than me.
Let's do a quick round robin, and I want each of you to kind of respond to this. We'll start with Brady. What's one thing local finance officers should be watching as we head into 2026?
Yeah, I think the big thing is the implementation of the major CEQA discussion that we talked about in the housing legislation with SB 79. SB 79 starts in July, and so it'll be curious to see and interesting to see what kind of development occurs with that law, as well as the combination of kind of the other significant laws that have passed in recent years and kind of what that results in. And I think the big thing that I'm keeping a very close eye on is the impact fee discussion. We're seeing a lot of chatter about that, and I know there was chatter historically about it last year when I first started here. And so keeping an eye on what that looks like and kind of where the next realm in the fight is going to be for housing stuff. And obviously we still have a housing crisis, and there's a lot of legislative ideas, and Cal Cities looks forward to being on the forefront of kind of leading the charge and doing what we need to do to be the voice of our local governments.
Yeah, so looking ahead to next year, I talked a lot about thinking about, from your city's perspective, preparing for climate risks, making sure you're prepared for that next disaster, whatever that priority disaster is. I think we're going to see a lot more on wildfire and disaster preparedness generally. There was actually a lot of bills introduced this year on wildfire that didn't end up making it through, which is a little surprising given just the focus for the year. I think we're going to see some issues around liability, and that has some fiscal implications there, right? So I think that's definitely going to be a big theme for 2026, and something cities should really keep it at the forefront.
Just one? I'm going to go back to the ballot measures again, but not just the measure itself, what the legislature's response is to that, whether that be a kind of an escape hatch for themselves to get it off the ballot and making sure that, we're at the table for that. I know our executive director, Carolyn Coleman, always says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And especially items like this, that is 100% true. So, I rely on the fiscal officers department here at Cal Cities, and same type of thing with CSMFO for the subject matter expertise on items like this. And so, I would just advocate for you all to please stay in touch with us as an advocacy team. We rely on you all. You're in the field. You understand this way better than we do. So when we see these things, if we can fire it off to you all and get your instant feedback, it makes our lives a heck of a lot easier. So that's what I'd say.
It is one of the reasons why CSMFO has leaders and members participate in Cal City's policy committees, is to be better informed, share those resources with our members. Again, such a great organization to share resources with its members and make sure that we're better informed about what's happening. There's so many areas that we're all expected to be fluent in. It's a relief to not have to be an expert in everything, but have experts in Cal Cities be able to explain things in a way that we can understand. So I really want to thank you for having me here at Cal Cities and to being on the podcast. Thank you. We might even make this a regular annual thing.
There we go.
So until next year, we will see you then. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.